Most people who argue with an MOT tester are wrong. Phil told us he had learned over 12 years to be comfortable with that. In 12 years of testing vehicles at his own workshop in the East Midlands, Phil heard every version of the same conversation. The car was fine last year, it passed without any issues 6 months ago. He drove it down from Scotland and nothing felt wrong. He has had it for 8 years and it has never let him down. My last garage said it was all fine. And in every one of those conversations, Phil said, the person telling him the car was fine believed it completely. The problem was never dishonesty. The problem was that they were judging the car by the experience of driving it. And there are things wrong with certain cars that driving simply does not reveal. We will call him Phil. 12 years as a qualified MOT tester and workshop principal in the East Midlands. He tested cars that arrived with confidence and left with a fail certificate and an owner who did not understand why. He tested cars that owners had driven for years without incident, where the reason they had driven without incident was not that the car was sound, but that the failure had not yet been triggered. And he tested cars where the gap between the owner's certainty and the actual condition of the vehicle was large enough to be frightening. He came to us with a specific list, not the cars that most commonly carry hidden defects in the used market. That is a different conversation. This is a personal list. 6 cars that Phil told us he would fail without hesitation, regardless of what the owner said, regardless of how confident they were, and regardless of what their last test results showed. 6 cars where the defect he was looking for was invisible to the owner, often invisible on a casual inspection, but clearly and unambiguously present when he looked in the right place with the right tools and the right experience. He said there is one car on this list where the owner's argument, the thing they said to try to get him to reconsider, was the most understandable argument he ever heard. And also, the most wrong. We will come to it. Because it involves a type of failure that British drivers in particular do not expect from the kind of car it affects. These are the 6 cars Phil says he would never let pass, no matter what the owner tells him. The first car is the one that produces the most heated conversations, because it is the car whose owners are most certain it is fine. The Toyota Prius, specifically the 2nd and 3rd generation models from 2004 to 2015, is a car with one of the strongest reliability reputations of anything that has passed through the British used car market. The hybrid powertrain is robust. The mechanical components are generally well engineered and well proven. Prius owners tend to be careful, attentive, and not the kind of people who ignore warning lights or skip service intervals. And in most respects, the Prius's reputation for longevity is entirely deserved. None of that was what Phil was looking at when a Prius came into his workshop. The body structure of the Prius, specifically the sill areas and the floor sections on the 2nd generation model, is prone to a pattern of corrosion that is accelerated by the design of the battery pack housing and the channels through which cooling air passes beneath the vehicle. Water and road salt accumulate in cavities adjacent to the battery housing on both sides of the underbody. The corrosion that develops in those cavities is not visible from inside the cabin. It is not visible from a standard visual walk-around. It develops against the inner face of the sill and the outer face of the floor section in a channel that can only be properly assessed from below the vehicle with a probe and adequate lighting. Phil told us that Prius owners, when he presented this finding, were consistently the most resistant of any owner he dealt with, because the Prius, in their experience, had been completely reliable. No warning lights, no noises, no handling changes, no indication of any kind that anything was wrong. And they were right. The corrosion Phil found in that location produces no driving symptom until it is structurally advanced, which is precisely why it needs to be found before it is structurally advanced. He failed a Prius that had come through a previous test station 3 times without any issue being raised. The owner was a district nurse, meticulous with her car, full service history, genuine low mileage for its age. She could not understand what Phil had found or why it had not been found before. He showed her. He took her beneath the ramp and showed her the probe going into the sill cavity, and the way the metal responded when the probe was applied. She said nothing for a moment. Then she asked how it could be safe to drive on roads when a car that looked and felt perfectly normal could be structurally compromised in a place nobody had told her to look. Phil said that was the best question any customer had ever asked him. And he did not have an answer that fully satisfied either of them. He also told us something about the Prius that speaks to a broader pattern. The reliability of the car, the fact that the engine, the hybrid system, and the battery management work so consistently creates a kind of complacency in the owner, and he said sometimes in the tester. A car that has given no mechanical trouble for 8 years and 200,000 miles carries an implied structural credibility it has not earned. The drivetrain is sound. The underbody is a different question. And the assumption that a car reliable enough to keep running through everything must also be structurally intact is an assumption, Phil said, cost Prius owners money more than on almost any other model in his testing career. The cost of addressing the sill corrosion runs from £400 for treatment and sealing of early-stage corrosion to over £2,000 for section replacement in advanced cases. The cost of not addressing it is structural. In a side impact, a significant curbing incident or a pothole strike at speed, a compromised sill does not absorb energy the way it was engineered to. The driver does not know that. The car gives no indication of it. Only the tester who looked in the right place with the right tool knows. And if they pass the car anyway, Phil said, they know something that follows them home. The second car is the one that surprised Phil most when he started seeing the pattern, because it is not a car that carries that reputation. The Renault Clio, specifically the Mark III and Mark IV generations from 2005 to 2019, is a car that has sold in enormous numbers in Britain. It is practical, affordable and available throughout the used market at prices that make it the default choice for younger drivers and smaller households. It is also, Phil told us, a car with a rear beam axle corrosion issue that is serious, common and almost universally underestimated by the buyers who bring them through for a test. The rear beam on a Clio of this generation corrodes at specific points on the beam itself and at the mounting brackets where it is attached to the body. On a car driven regularly on salted British roads and not treated underneath, this corrosion develops at a rate that Phil described as consistent and predictable. What is not predictable is when a buyer or a previous tester identifies it as a fail rather than an amber advisory. Phil said he had seen Clios where the rear beam corrosion had been noted as an advisory on the previous test, and the car had come back 12 months later with the advisory unaddressed and the corrosion substantially worse. Not because the owner was irresponsible, because they did not understand what the advisory meant. They read minor corrosion to rear beam as the kind of note that appears on every older car and requires no particular urgency. By the time it came to Phil, it required rather more than that. He failed a Mark III Clio brought in by a young woman who had just bought it privately for £3,100. Fresh MOT from the seller issued 6 weeks earlier. Phil put it over his ramp and found rear beam corrosion that, by any honest assessment, should not have produced a pass certificate at the time it was issued. He called her over to the inspection pit and showed her. She asked if the previous garage had seen it. He told her that it was present on the previous test certificate as an advisory. She had not known that advisory existed. It was on the certificate. She had not known to read it. The car was not safe to drive. She was £3,100 into a car she could not take on the road. The repair estimate was £860. Phil said the owner of the previous test station was, by his assessment, not dishonest. He was probably under commercial pressure, probably aware that a fail would lose him a customer, and probably telling himself the corrosion was close enough to the advisory boundary to justify the decision he made. Phil said he understood all of that. He also said it meant a woman had spent £3,100 on a car she could not drive, and understanding why it happened did not make it acceptable. Now we come to the third car, and this is where the owner's argument gets harder to dismiss, because the owner is almost always someone who knows their car extremely well. The Mazda MX-5, the Mark II and Mark III generations covering 1998 to 2015, is the car that produces the most passionate owners Phil ever encountered in 12 years of testing. They know their car. They have often owned it for years. They have maintained it carefully, garaged it in winter, applied under seal, done everything right. And when Phil failed it, they were not just upset. They were offended, because they had looked after this car better than most people look after anything. Phil told us the MX-5's sill and floor pan corrosion issue is one of the most persistent structural problems in any British roadster and one of the most reliably underestimated by the people who own them. Not because those owners are careless, but because they have been looking at the wrong places with a great deal of attention. The MX-5 is a low car. The sills are exposed, the floor pan runs close to the road surface and is subject to road spray in conditions that a higher-bodied vehicle handles differently. Even on a garaged, carefully maintained example, the inner sill structure and the floor pan reinforcement points can develop corrosion in locations that are not accessible from a standard undersealing treatment and that are not visible without removing internal trim or using a probe from below the vehicle. Phil described the mechanism in terms that the MX-5 owners he had dealt with found the hardest to accept. The outer sill may look presentable, even excellent. It may have been treated and maintained and inspected and found clean, but the inner sill, the structural section behind the outer face, corrodes from moisture that enters through the drain channels built into the sill cavity and collects in the box section below. The drain channels, if partially blocked with debris and compacted road material, hold that moisture against the inner metal. It sits there, between visits, between treatments, and it attacks from the inside in a direction that no amount of outer sill care addresses. He failed a Mark II MX-5 whose owner had owned it for 9 years, garaged it every winter without exception, undersealed it annually at a reputable specialist, and maintained the outer bodywork in condition that Phil described as exceptional. The owner was, in his words, exactly the kind of person you want looking after a car. He had done everything recommended, and the inner sill on both sides had still developed corrosion at the drain channel junction because the channels had partially blocked over several winters and held moisture against the box section in a location his treatment program had never reached. The owner argued, calmly, knowledgeably, and with the certainty of someone who had invested 9 years and significant money into caring for this specific car. He listed everything he had done. He was thorough. He was not wrong about any of it, and every single thing he listed was outer sill work. Phil got down with him and showed him. He put the probe in the drain channel opening on the near side sill and let the owner hear the sound it made when the probe met corroded metal that should not have been there. Then there was silence. The repair on that car was inner sill section replacement on both sides, £1,120. The owner was upset, but he thanked Phil before he left. He said he drove that car hard on summer evenings on roads he liked. He said he would rather know now than later. Phil said that was the right way to think about it. He also said it was the most expensive summer evening conversation that owner would have that year. The fourth car is one that Phil said almost always surprises people when it comes up, because it is associated with environmental responsibility, not safety risk. The Mitsubishi Outlander PHEV, specifically the first generation from 2013 to 2018, entered the British market as a practical, capable plug-in hybrid family SUV, at a time when PHEV technology was still new enough to carry a certain prestige. It was bought by careful buyers, often fleet-managed or company car-sourced, and it came into the used market in large numbers as those fleets refreshed. The prices at which it trades, often between £8,000 and £16,000 for well-specified examples, reflect a car that buyers approach with a degree of confidence. Phil told us the first-generation Outlander PHEV has a rear subframe corrosion pattern that he encountered consistently and that he said is underreported relative to its prevalence because the car's profile, modern, hybrid, environmentally conscious, does not prompt the level of structural skepticism that the car's actual underbody condition often warrants. The rear subframe on the first-generation Outlander PHEV corrodes at its mounting points in a pattern that Phil described as accelerated relative to equivalent conventional vehicles of the same age. The reason, he said, is partly the additional weight the PHEV carries through its rear-mounted battery and electric motor assembly, which creates higher stress concentrations at the mounting points, and partly the tendency for road salt and moisture to accumulate in the cavities around the subframe in ways that are not addressed by the standard underbody protection applied at the factory. What the owner sees, a modern, sophisticated vehicle with hybrid technology, a recent service history, and none of the visual indicators of the kind of structural problem Phil was looking for. What Phil saw, a rear subframe mounting area where the body metal surrounding 2 of the 4 main attachment points had corroded to a degree that the subframe was not held to manufacturer specification on a vehicle that would be presented to buyers as a well-maintained example of a prestigious hybrid model. He told us about an Outlander PHEV that arrived at his workshop having just been sold privately for £11,800. The seller had provided a recent MOT certificate and a service history. The buyer had done exactly what they were supposed to do. Phil found the rear subframe mounting issue within 10 minutes of putting the vehicle on his ramp. The repair estimate was just over £1,400. The buyer had been in the car for 3 days. The conversation was difficult, not because the owner was unreasonable, because there was genuinely nothing they had done wrong. They had bought correctly. They had checked what they were advised to check. The problem was a failure mode that no consumer guidance document had told them to specifically look for, on a car whose identity gave no indication it needed to be looked for. Phil said the more modern and apparently sophisticated a vehicle is, the less likely a buyer is to ask a structural question about it, and the less likely they are to ask that question, the less likely it is that anyone is giving them an honest answer. The fifth car is the one Phil said he failed more times on this specific basis than any other single model. The Peugeot 207, covering 2006 to 2012, and to a lesser extent its successor the 208 from 2012 onwards, is one of the most common used cars in the lower end of the British market. It is bought by people on practical budgets who need reliable transport and cannot spend heavily. The prices it trades at, often between £1,000 and £4,000 for older examples, mean that buyers are not allocating money for independent inspections. They are buying on the MOT certificate and the asking price. And the MOT certificate, Phil told us, is exactly where the problem sits. The rear torsion beam on a Peugeot 207 corrodes at a rate that Phil described as among the fastest of any volume car he regularly tested. The corrosion is concentrated at specific points on the beam and at the trailing arm brackets, in locations that are not difficult to see on a ramp, but that are easy to classify as minor if the tester is working quickly and the customer is waiting. And the commercial dynamic of the testing environment is, as Phil described in some stations he was aware of, not entirely objective. He said the 207 was the car where he saw the biggest discrepancy between what other test stations had recorded on previous certificates and what he found on his ramp. Cars coming through with a history of advisory notices that had been carried forward year after year without progressing to a fail, on corrosion that had clearly passed a fail threshold at some point during that history. Cars where the advisory language on successive certificates had stayed identical, copied Phil's word, while the physical condition of the beam had deteriorated beyond what the advisory described. Phil failed a 207 owned by a man in his early 60s who used it for local errands, who had owned it for 7 years, and who had tested it at the same local station every year. The station had noted the rear beam corrosion as an advisory each time. The owner had understood this as confirmation that the situation was stable. It was not stable. By the time Phil saw it, the beam had corroded at one trailing arm bracket to a degree that the bracket's attachment to the beam was structurally unreliable under load. The owner said he drove very carefully. He said he never went on motorways. He said the car had been completely fine for 7 years, and he did not understand how something that had been on the advisory list all along could suddenly be a fail. Phil told him directly. An advisory means the condition exists and requires monitoring. It does not mean the condition is acceptable in its current state forever. It means that at the time of the previous test, it had not yet reached a fail threshold. That threshold can be crossed between one test and the next. And when it is crossed, a careful driver and a gentle routine do not change it. The beam is what it is. The bracket is what it is. And what they were on that day was a fail. The repair cost was £640. The owner found the money, fixed the car, and came back the following week to collect his pass certificate. On the way out, he told Phil he was going to start looking underneath his cars more often. Phil said he was glad to hear it. He said that conversation, or something close to it, had happened more times across 12 years than he could accurately count. The sixth car is the one where Phil said the argument was the hardest to sit through. Not because it was aggressive, because it was rational, detailed, and delivered by someone who understood cars better than most of the people who had ever brought a vehicle into his workshop. And it was still wrong. The Range Rover Sport, specifically the first generation from 2005 to 2013, is a car that attracts a specific type of owner. Capable, financially comfortable, often with a real interest in vehicles and a practical knowledge of how they work. These are not people who are naive about cars. They are people who have read up, who know the model, who are often aware of the issues associated with it, and who believe, based on their management of those issues, that their specific example is the exception. Phil told us the air suspension system on the first-generation Range Rover Sport is not what he was specifically failing these cars on, though it is the issue most owners anticipate. What he was failing them on was the chassis itself, specifically the structural sections around the rear subframe mounting points and the areas adjacent to the spare wheelbay, where corrosion develops in a pattern that is aggressive, that is accelerated by the weight the vehicle carries and the loads it generates. And that is almost universally underestimated by owners who are focused on the mechanical and electronic systems they know need attention. The structural sections around the rear subframe mounting on the first-generation Sport corrode in a location and a pattern that is not visible from a standard underneath inspection without specific attention to the areas behind and above the rear axle line. The corrosion is behind panels, in box sections, at the point where the subframe's forces are transmitted into the body. It does not produce a symptom. It does not crack or groan or handle differently. It silently reduces the structural integrity of the attachment until the attachment is no longer doing what it was designed to do. And in a vehicle of this weight, running the loads these vehicles run on the roads they are driven on, that matters. Phil described the owner who produced the argument he found hardest to answer, a man who had owned his Range Rover Sport for 6 years, who had replaced the air suspension compressor himself, who had replaced the rear height sensors, who had sourced parts, maintained records, and approached the ownership of a known problematic vehicle with a level of systematic diligence that Phil said he respected. Who knew chapter and verse every commonly cited issue with this vehicle and had addressed every one of them, who told Phil with genuine confidence that he knew this car and he knew it was sound. Phil took him under the ramp, he walked him through the structural sections in question, he showed him where the corrosion was, in the box sections behind the rear axle, in the location the subframe loads pass through. The man asked technical questions. Good ones, Phil said, the questions of someone who actually understood what he was looking at. He asked about the geometry implications, he asked about repair methodology, he asked whether certain remediation approaches would hold. Phil answered directly. Then the man was quiet for a time. Then he said, I looked after everything I could see. Phil said, I know you did. That is exactly what makes this one hard. The problem is what neither of us could see until we were looking in the right place. The structural repair on that vehicle was assessed at £2,280. The owner authorised the work without significant hesitation, which Phil said spoke to the kind of person he was. He came back when it was done and said something that Phil told us he remembers clearly. He said, I am genuinely grateful, but I'm also genuinely angry that nobody told me to look there. Phil said, I know. That is precisely why we are having this conversation. That is why I agreed to this. Phil said that encounter stayed with him because it demonstrated the limits of even the most thorough and responsible ownership. The man had done everything that automotive culture, enthusiast communities, and mainstream advice had told him to do. He had addressed every known issue. And the unknown issue, the structural corrosion in the location nobody had suggested he look, had developed regardless. The knowledge to find it existed. It just did not exist in the spaces where owners are expected to learn. 6 cars, and in every case the same pattern. The owner believed the car was sound, not unreasonably. They had driven it, it had behaved, nothing had announced itself as wrong. And the MOT certificate from last year or the year before or the one issued 6 weeks ago by someone who had a different approach to what the fail threshold looked like had confirmed their confidence. Phil told us that the most dangerous phrase in the British used car market is not this car has no history or this car hasn't been serviced. It is this car passed its MOT. Because passing an MOT means a tester found nothing requiring a fail on the day they ran the test. It does not mean nothing is wrong. It does not mean the car will pass the next test. It does not mean the corrosion that was an advisory last year has stayed where it was. And it does not mean the tester who issued that certificate had the time, the equipment, the commercial freedom, and the specific knowledge of that model's failure points to find what Phil found when he looked. He said the argument he heard most often, across all 6 of these cars in different forms from different people, was a version of the same thing. I have been driving this car for years. I know how it feels. I know when something is wrong. Phil said he was always respectful of that. He was never dismissive, and he always said the same thing back. The things on this list do not feel wrong. That is exactly what makes them dangerous. There are 2 things Phil said every owner of any older car should do, regardless of model. Get the car lifted and specifically inspected for the known failure points of that model. Not a general service check, a targeted inspection by someone who knows what to look for on that specific vehicle. And look at the advisory history on every previous MOT certificate, not just the past result. An advisory that recurs across multiple certificates is not a stable situation. It is a situation that is progressing. And the question is not whether it will progress to a fail. It is whether it will do so before the next test or after. Phil finished the conversation with something he said he had wanted to say publicly for some time. He said, owners trust their cars because their cars have not let them down. But a car that has not let you down is not the same as a car that will not. The defects on this list are not waiting to be discovered. They are already there. The The only question is whether the person who looks at the car next knows where to find them. 6 cars an ex-MOT tester would never let pass. Not because their owners are wrong to love them, not because they have been poorly maintained or carelessly kept, but because there are things happening beneath the surface of each one that driving does not reveal, that confidence cannot correct, and that the MOT test, as it is written, as it is resourced, and as it is applied across the range of stations and testers in Britain today, does not consistently catch. Tell us in the comments. Have you ever had a car failed on something you were certain was not an issue, and been shown under the ramp that you were wrong? Tell us what it was and what it cost, because that experience put on record is worth more than any advisory notice that gets carried forward and ignored.